Imagine waking up one day to discover that your entire life savings have been wiped out overnight. All of your hard-earned money is gone in an instant. This may sound like a nightmare, but it could soon become a reality for millions of Americans. The United States is facing a debt crisis of epic proportions, with the national debt soaring to unprecedented levels. In this video, we will explore the looming disaster, its impact on the economy, and potential solutions to avoid the worst-case scenario. Buckle up, because the future of the US economy is at stake, and the clock is ticking. As of 2023, the US national debt stands at a staggering $31.5 trillion, equivalent to the combined national debt of the next 7 largest global economies. With a debt-to-GDP ratio of 1.23 and over 40% of all dollars created in the last 2 years, the US economy is in a precarious state. The danger of a new Great Depression looms, or worse, a complete collapse. The US debt ceiling, which limits the amount of money the government can borrow, has been a point of contention in American politics for decades. The ceiling has been suspended or raised 13 times since 2013, when it stood at just under $16.4 trillion. These changes were introduced to accommodate the increasing national debt, but many conservatives believe it should be lowered to promote fiscal responsibility. In this video, we will explore the US national debt crisis, its impact on the US economy, and potential solutions to this looming financial disaster. We will also examine the history of the debt ceiling and its role in the current state of the US economy. Join us as we delve into this complex issue and shed light on one of the most pressing problems facing the US today. But before we get into it, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe. We will cover some important and controversial topics on this channel, and your support will really help us with the algorithm. Compared to the rest of the world, the total dollar amount of the US national debt is enormous. It's the same size as the debt levels of the next 7 largest world economies combined. These economies include China, Japan, Germany, India, and the UK. To put this into perspective, the combined GDP of the 7 countries is $35 trillion, whereas the US GDP is just over the $23 trillion mark. This high level of debt puts the US in an unstable position and has significant implications for the economy and beyond. One way to assess the size of the national debt is by looking at the debt to GDP ratio. GDP measures the monetary value of final goods and services, those bought by the final user, produced in a country per year, and is commonly used to compare the health of different countries' economies. So, the debt to GDP ratio measures the amount of debt relative to the size of the economy. The higher the ratio, the greater the burden of its repayments on the economy. The current US debt to GDP ratio is 1.23, meaning the US national debt is around 123% of its GDP. The impact of the national debt on the US economy is significant. According to the US Treasury, interest payments on its debt equal 14% of total federal spending. Repaying the interest on the debt puts a strain on the federal budget, which means that the government has less money to spend on other priorities, such as healthcare, education, and infrastructure. The national debt also has implications for the value of the US dollar. The more the US government borrows, the more the dollar's value will likely decrease. This is because when there is an increase in the supply of dollars in the market, without a corresponding increase in things to buy them with, the currency's value decreases. The decrease in value has implications for the US economy, as it makes US exports more competitive as they become cheaper relative to other countries' currencies. It also makes imports from these countries more expensive, leading to inflation. So, let's delve deeper into what the US debt actually is. The US national debt is the sum of all the money the US government owes its creditors. It includes 2 types of debt: public debt and intragovernmental debt. Public debt is the amount owed to private individuals, institutions, and foreign governments, usually through issuing bonds. Intragovernmental debt, however, is the amount owed to other government agencies. This might include the Treasury borrowing money from government pension funds, for example. Intragovernmental debt makes up about 22% of the total borrowed each year, and is important as the interest paid on this borrowing stays within the government, so does not increase the overall debt. Debt is an issue for governments for 2 reasons. First, because it has to be paid back at some point, but second, and more importantly, in the short term, it generates interest. The interest is money paid to creditors at regular intervals as the cost of borrowing. The US government pays a very low interest rate of around 2% per year, compared to the 10% the average American will pay on a personal loan. Now that we understand the gravity of the US national debt crisis, let's turn our attention to the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling is a legal limit on the amount of money the US can borrow to pay its bills. It's essentially a credit limit imposed by Congress, and any amount borrowed beyond that limit requires an increase in the ceiling. The history of the debt debt ceiling is complex, with its origins dating back to the First World War. Initially, the debt ceiling was a mere formality, and Congress would raise the limit whenever necessary. However, in recent decades, the debt ceiling has become a tool for political brinkmanship, with politicians from both sides of the aisle using it as a bargaining chip to push their agendas. The consequences of not raising the debt ceiling are severe. The US government could default on its debts, which could have catastrophic consequences for the global economy. The value of the US dollar could plummet, leading to hyperinflation, and interest rates would skyrocket. The US government would be unable to fund essential programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and there could be a severe economic downturn. Currently, there is an ongoing debt ceiling debate in Congress, with Republicans refusing to vote to increase the limit unless Democrats agree to spending cuts. Democrats, on the other hand, argue that raising the debt ceiling is necessary to fund essential programs and avoid a catastrophic default. As we have mentioned, it's worth noting that this is not the first time that the US has faced a debt ceiling crisis. In 2011, a similar impasse between Democrats and Republicans led to a downgrade of the US's credit rating, and in 2013, the government shut down for 16 days. The current debate is a high-stakes game of political brinkmanship, with neither side wanting to be seen as giving ground. Famous investors like Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan Chase, have warned of these dire consequences, and US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has urged Congress to act, stating that failure to do so would have catastrophic economic consequences. She has also pointed out that not raising the debt ceiling would make it harder for the government to respond to future crises, such as natural disasters or economic downturns, and has to resort to extraordinary measures to avoid breaching the limit. The Treasury Secretary has said her actions will buy time until Congress can pass legislation that will either raise the nation's $31.4 trillion borrowing authority or suspend the limit for a period of time. But she said it's critical that Congress act in a timely manner. Jamie Dimon has also emphasized the importance of raising the debt ceiling, stating that a default on US debt would be potentially catastrophic. He added that such a scenario could cause interest rates to rise and lead to a severe economic downturn. Dimon has also warned of the dangers of inflation, stating that he expects US interest rates to hit 6%, up from their current position at 4.75%. The US national debt was already at record levels before COVID-19, but when the pandemic struck, it sent shockwaves to the US economy. In an effort to mitigate the economic fallout, Congress passed several stimulus packages, including the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan. These stimulus packages were designed to provide relief to individuals, small businesses, and industries impacted by the pandemic. The total cost of these packages was $5.54 trillion, equivalent to over 26% of GDP. Much of the funding went towards direct payments to individuals, increased unemployment benefits, and loans for small businesses. Despite the cost, many economists argued that the stimulus packages were necessary to prevent a deep and prolonged recession. By providing individuals and businesses with direct payments and increased benefits, the packages helped to stimulate consumer spending and helped to prevent mass bankruptcies of small businesses, which are both critical components of the US economy. However, some argue that the stimulus packages needed to be more effective in stimulating the economy. For example, while the packages provided much needed relief to individuals and businesses in the short term, they did not address long-term structural issues in the US economy. Additionally, some argue that the packages needed to be more targeted towards those who needed it most, with large corporations receiving significant aid. Regardless of their effectiveness, it's clear that the stimulus packages have added significantly to the national debt. And as we've discussed, the US already had a record level of debt before the pandemic hit, and these stimulus packages have only added to that burden. So, the US national debt crisis is a looming threat to the US economy. The debt ceiling, the ongoing political debate in Congress, and the impact of COVID-19 stimulus packages have all contributed to the situation. But what does the future hold for the US economy? Despite the impact of COVID-19, there have been signs of recovery. The stock market has rebounded, unemployment rates have decreased, and there are indications of a rebound in economic growth. However, the national debt remains a serious issue. Looking ahead, there are potential risks and challenges facing the US economy. Rising inflation, a possible increase in interest rates, and a slowdown in economic growth could all exacerbate the debt crisis, with some commentators comparing the future state of the US economy to the Great Depression. Investor Mark Spitznagel recently referred to the current situation of ballooning debt as the greatest tinderbox time bomb in financial history. But in the short term, the United States Treasury will exhaust its emergency measures to prevent a debt default sometime between July and September 2023, unless Congress raises the $31.4 trillion debt limit. The US national debt crisis is a complex and controversial issue that requires urgent attention. The enormous debt burden threatens to undermine the economy and compromise the country's future prosperity. And it's not just the national debt that's a problem for the US. Consumer debt in the country was at $16.36 trillion in 2022, up from $15.31 trillion in 2021, a 7% increase from the previous year. According to Experian, a data analytics and consumer credit rating company, credit card debt increased by 16% over the period, and personal loans by 18.3%. The debt ceiling debate only adds to the uncertainty and puts the country's creditworthiness at risk. To avoid a catastrophic default, policymakers must come together and find a solution that balances fiscal responsibility with the need to fund essential programs and investments. This may involve a combination of spending cuts, revenue increases, and structural reforms to the government's budget and borrowing practices. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the US national debt crisis. If you found this video informative, please share it with your friends and family, and remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more content from IE.